October 2026, Korumburra Road, Wonthaggi, Bass Coast, Victoria. The last day at the Cyclone factory. The drop forge line falls silent for the final time. Approximately noon. 15 workers file out of the Korumburra Road gate, some with 50 years service. At its peak, in the 1980s and 90s, this factory employed 200 men and women. It produced over 350,000 garden tools a year. The green-handled Australian-made Cyclone shovel, forged from 3-tonne coils of steel plate, arriving weekly, sat in every Australian suburban shed from Perth to Cairns. Not because the workers failed, not because the machines wore out, not because Australians stopped buying shovels. Because 12 years earlier, on the 21st of May 2014, a New York-listed diversified holding company called Griffon Corporation bought Cyclone for $36 million. And on the 8th of June 2026, Griffon sold the Australian operation for $235 million, a 6.5 times return, while closing the 2 Australian factories that had made the products. 12 years, 6.5 times, 15 Australians walking out the gate. If you ever pushed a wheelbarrow at Wonthaggi, forged a shovel blade at Korumburra Road, or bought a green-handled Cyclone spade from the Bunnings garden aisle, hit subscribe. This channel keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. The Last Day. The men and women on the Wonthaggi factory floor know what today is. They have known for 5 months since the 29th of May 2026, when the Wonthaggi Sentinel Times ran the headline, 75-year-old Wonthaggi Cyclone factory to close in October. At approximately noon on the last day, the drop forge line falls silent for the final time. The Cyclone Wonthaggi factory had at its peak in the 1980s and 1990s employed approximately 200 men and women across 3-tonne weekly steel plate deliveries, long-handle plumber's shovels, trenching shovels, short-handle garden spades, hammers, tomahawks, mattocks, picks, the full range of Australian domestic and light industrial hand tools. The Grafton facility in northern New South Wales, which had supplied Wonthaggi's timber handles, closed a month earlier, in September 2026. 15 workers walk out of the Korumburra Road gate, some with 50 years service, men who had trained on the drop forge as apprentices under Lou Gray or his successors, men whose fathers had worked the same line before them. Women who had drilled, polished, lacquered, and packed the finished tools. AMES Australasia, the Doncaster-headquartered Australian subsidiary of the New York-listed Griffon Corporation, issued a statement to the Sentinel Times. The closure was not taken lightly. It reflected the sustained economic pressures facing local manufacturing in Australia: career counselling, outplacement, HR support, employee assistance program, production moves offshore to China. The Korumburra Road site, the 2-acre parcel that stretches from what is now Dan Murphy's to the Mackenzie Street retail stores, will soon be big box retail redevelopment, including a Bunnings. 58 years earlier, in 1968, the Wonthaggi State coal mine had closed. The mine that had, in 1950, supplied the timber from which this very factory was built. The mine died first. The factory outlived it by 57 years. Now the factory joins the mine. But this story does not begin at the Korumburra Road gate in October 2026. It begins 128 years earlier, in a Melbourne beekeeping supply shop, where 2 men read an advertisement in a US beekeeper's journal and wrote a letter to Michigan. Chapter 2. Chambers and Thompson, 1898, early 1890s, Melbourne. Leonard Tasman. Chambers and William Eastwood. Thompson run a beekeeping supply partnership at a Melbourne commercial address. Hives, frames, smokers, bee veils, imported queen bees, extractors and comb foundation. Chambers is a Melbourne-based beekeeping merchant. His birth and death dates are not preserved in the archival record. Thompson, born 1868, Brighton, Victoria, son of James Thompson and Ruth Eastwood. He will, in another life, become a Phillip Island civic patriarch, founder of the Worley Bush Nursing Hospital at Cowes, namesake of Thompson Avenue, benefactor of the Cowes Church Missions. But in the early 1890s, Chambers and Thompson are Melbourne beekeeping merchants. Chambers reads a United States Beekeeper's Journal, a trade publication of the American apiary industry. A small advertisement catches his eye, not for hives, not for bees, for a wire-weaving fence machine, patented, American invented, manufactured by the Lane brothers of Holly, Michigan. The machine is called Cyclone. Chambers writes to Michigan, secures Australian rights by mail correspondence, a process that would have taken months by Trans-Pacific steamship. 1898, Melbourne, Chambers and Thompson. Found the Cyclone Woven Wire Fence Machine Company. Original works, Franklin Street, Melbourne. The beekeeping business quietly retires. 1899, the word machine is dropped from the company name. Cyclone becomes Cyclone Woven Wire Fence Company. 1905, Chambers and Thompson invent spring coil hinge joint fencing at Franklin Street, a prefabricated woven wire fencing design that would become one of Cyclone's signature products for the next half-century. The spring coil hinge allows the fencing to flex under stock impact without breaking, a critical innovation for the Australian rural fencing market, where cattle and sheep test every metre of wire, every day for years. 1906. A larger factory is added to accommodate spring coil production. 1913. Swanston Street works added. Cyclone now has 2 Melbourne manufacturing sites. By the early 1920s, Cyclone has manufacturing in Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney and Perth. Later, Brisbane, Townsville, Launceston. 6 state capitals plus regional Queensland and Tasmania. The Cyclone Fence and Gate Company, as it is now known, has become one of Australia's dominant industrial wire manufacturers. Thompson had, by the 1920s, become a wealthy man. He would use his personal wealth to fund the Worley Bush Nursing Hospital at Cowes on Phillip Island, opening the hospital in 1923, when he and his wife purchased the home of the late Robert Walpole and presented it to the people of the island. Worley was Victoria's first bush nursing hospital. Thompson would live until 1952, dying with an estate of £164,000, most of it bequeathed to Australian Church Missions and the Worley Hospital he had built. Chambers and Thompson had begun with hives and bee veils. They are now supplying the wire that fences the wheat belt. By 1934, Cyclone's ring-lock fencing had replaced plain wire and dropper across the Australian wheat belt and the merino stations. Cyclone was, in the market's phrase, fencing. Chapter 3. The wire that fenced Australia, the 1920s and 1930s. Cyclone's ornamental woven wire and wrought iron gates and fencing form, in the words of Borrell's later corporate history, one of the most distinctive elements of Australian urban architecture of the 1920s and 30s. Every suburban Melbourne front yard from Brunswick to Brighton has Cyclone chain link. Many Australian rules football grounds have Cyclone fencing. Every rural school playground boundary has Cyclone. Every industrial factory perimeter has Cyclone chain link topped with Cyclone barbed wire. The product lines multiply: spring coil, prefabricated hinged joint fencing, ring lock, rural fencing, chain link, barbed wire, farm gates, playground equipment, scaffolding, tubular steel, conveyor belts. 1925. Corporate RE organisation, Cyclone Fence and Gate Company, Proprietary Limited. The name becomes standardised across Australian trade. 1930. Cyclone House, the flagship Melbourne showroom, opens in Hardware Street, Melbourne. The Cyclone badge on the Hardware Street facade. The name Cyclone becomes synonymous with fencing across the Australian urban and rural landscape. The wheat belt is fenced in cyclone wire. The merino stations of central New South Wales and Western Queensland are enclosed in cyclone wire. The sugarcane paddocks of the Burdekin and the Mackay hinterland are bordered in cyclone wire. The suburban Australian gardens of Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane are edged with cyclone chain link. The cattle stations of the Northern Territory and the Kimberley, some of the largest pastoral operations in the world, run cyclone wire across the outback. 2001 market research would quote Australian farmers with the phrase, "Cyclone is fencing." Australia's industrial engineering capacity in the 1930s is concentrated across a small number of firms, Ruwalt at Richmond for heavy engineering, Kelly and Lewis at Springvale for pumps, John Hine and Son in Sydney, Hercus in Adelaide, and Cyclone across 6 state capitals for wire and fencing. Together, these firms build most of what modern Australia is fenced, framed and forged from. 1940. Cyclone publishes its catalogue number 40, a comprehensive illustrated product listing spanning wire, fencing, gates and industrial products. The catalogue survives on the Internet Archive as a period artefact, a 1940 window into the pre-war cyclone empire at its height. And on the 11th of June, 1940, 19 months after Robert Menzies had declared it his melancholy duty that Britain and Australia were at war with Germany, a 67-year-old industrialist named Essington Lewis was appointed Director General of Munitions and hung a framed motto on his office wall in Melbourne. Chapter 4. I Am Work, May 1940. Melbourne, Prime Minister Robert Menzies appoints Essington Lewis, Managing Director of the Broken Hill Proprietary Company, as Director General of Munitions. On the wall of Lewis's office at Munitions headquarters in Melbourne, framed in block capitals, I Am Work. This is Essington Lewis's personal creed, not a Cyclone Company motto, but Cyclone worked to it. The 11th of June, 1940. The Department of Munitions is formally established, Cyclone Fence and Gate Company, Proprietary Limited, with manufacturing plants in Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney, Perth, Brisbane, Townsville and Launceston is one of Australia's principal wire manufacturers. Wire is a war material. Per Borrell's corporate history, later published in Borrell's First 50 Years. With World War II, Cyclone, with its expertise in the wire industry, was quickly requisitioned to provide supplies for military purposes. The wartime demands stretched the capabilities both of the company's plants and personnel to their limit. Wire-based materials for military use. The specific product mix is not preserved in the accessible archival record, but Cyclone's wire capability suggests the categories. Barbed wire for battlefield perimeters and prisoner of war camp fencing. Concertina wire for defensive military positions. Plain fencing wire for military installations and airfields across the Pacific. And North African theatres, wireframe supports for camouflage netting. The Cyclone wire-making machines, the same machines that had fenced the wheat belt through the 1920s and framed the suburban Australian garden through the 1930s, run through the war years for the Department of Munitions. Peak wartime workforce at the Cyclone factories, not preserved in accessible records. Peak Australian wartime munitions employment across all industries reached approximately 20,000. By 1945, per the same Borrell corporate history, Cyclone's civilian trade had totally dropped off. The company that had 6 years earlier been supplying every suburban front fence and every farm gate in Australia is by 1945 making almost nothing for civilian purchase. The war has eaten the civilian trade. The pivot back to civilian production would define the next quarter century, and within 5 years it would produce the Wonthaggi factory. In 1950, on a 2-acre site beside the Wonthaggi railway station, Cyclone opened a new drop forging factory. It had been built from the salvaged timber of the coal mine that had just closed. Chapter 5. Wonthaggi, 1950-1949, Melbourne, Cyclone Fence and Gate Company faces a labour shortage in its Melbourne plants. The post-war decentralisation policy of the Victorian state government, actively directing new manufacturing outside metropolitan Melbourne, encourages Cyclone to establish a regional operation. The State Decentralisation Committee proposes Wonthaggi, Bass Coast, approximately 130 kilometres southeast of Melbourne, a coal mining town in structural decline. The Wonthaggi State Coal Mine opened late 1909 as a Victorian government emergency response to the New South Wales coal strike of 1909, which had cut Melbourne's coal supply, had become uneconomic. By the 1950s, its main customer, the Victorian Railways, was progressively switching to diesel and electric locomotive power. Coal demand was collapsing. The mine was progressively closing shafts through the late 1940s. Wonthaggi has available labour, miners looking for post-mining work, a railway connection to Melbourne, and crucially, buildings from soon-to-be-closed coal mine shafts available for salvage. The salvage. Cyclone acquires the disused No. 18 shaft buildings of the Wonthaggi State Coal Mine. Ex-state coal mine carpenters and riggers dismantle them. Ern Easton, local Wonthaggi carpenter, supervises the re-erection on the 2-acre site beside the Wonthaggi railway station. Fred Webb, Cyclone's fixer, solves the material supply problems, per Tom Gannon in the Sentinel Times, 19th of January 1988. Nails were hard to come by. Reinforcement for cement was unavailable. So 2.5-inch steel cable from the closed eastern area coal mine had to be unstranded to 5/8 of an inch. Cement was in such short supply that quite illegally, Fred Webb got San Remo fishermen to bring tons of the precious material from Tasmania. Heavy cross members, the massive load-bearing timbers of the No. 18 shaft, timbers that had held up 100 metres of Wonthaggi geology for a generation, are re-erected by block and tackle and hand crab winch by ex-state coal mine men accustomed to erecting mine poppet legs. Read that again. The factory that would forge Australia's shovels for the next 76 years was built from the salvaged bones of a dying coal mine, held together by steel cable unstranded from the eastern area mine, and cement smuggled from Tasmania by San Remo fishing boats because the post-war Melbourne cement supply had run out. October 1950. The Wonthaggi Cyclone factory opens. First plant manager, Lou Gray, an experienced drop forging specialist from Melbourne. Gray brings the drop forge expertise that Wonthaggi lacks. The town has coal miners, not tool makers. Gray hires 40 men. Some contemporary sources say the initial staff was closer to 15 for the drop forge line. The first product manufactured, Cyclone hammers. Lou Gray would run the Wonthaggi factory through the post-war decades. His son Alan Gray would follow him into the industry. 1954. Floor area doubled. Employment reaches 100. Cyclone adds spade and shovel production to the hammer line. 1960. Capital investment exceeds £300,000. New drop forge presses installed. New pattern shop constructed. Wonthaggi becomes the only Cyclone factory in Australia to employ women. Drilling stations, polishing benches, lacquering booths, packing lines. Wartime industrial mobilisation had opened factory floors to women across Australia. Wonthaggi kept them there. And by the early 1970s, when Cyclone closed its Melbourne operations entirely and transferred the whole drop forging capacity to Wonthaggi, the Bass Coast town had become the beating heart of Australia's garden tool empire. If you've made it this far, through the Franklin Street founding, the cyclone wire that fenced the wheat belt, and the Wonthaggi factory built from salvaged coal mine timber and cement smuggled from Tasmania by fishing boat, hit the like button and subscribe. This channel keeps these stories alive. Wonthaggi Cyclone payslip, AMWU delegate card, or a green-handled shovel in the shed. Drop it in the comments. Chapter 6. The Empire. Early 1970s. Melbourne. Cyclone closes its Melbourne operations entirely. All drop forging capacity transfers to Wonthaggi. Per Lou Gray, recorded in the 1988 Sentinel Times retrospective. Orders flooded in overnight. Wonthaggi was doubled in factory size. Wonthaggi diversifies into custom forgings for the Australian automotive industry and the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, the Empire Products. Forged and manufactured at Wonthaggi through the 1970s and 1980s. Shovels, spades, axes, tomahawks, hammers, screwdrivers, socket sets, spanners, mattocks, picks, forks, rakes, hoes, edges, wheelbarrows. The Made in Australia stamp on every steel blade. The full modern range, shovels, spades, augers, pincers, bars, tampers, picks, mattocks, cultivators, forks, hoes, rakes, reeders, spreaders, aerators, edges, pruners, snips, sloppers, shears, sauteurs, axes, hatchets, splitters and wedges. The green-handled Australian-made Cyclone shovel. The icon. Forged from 3-tonne coils of steel plate, arriving weekly at Corumbura Road. Timber handles supplied from the Grafton Nisabao plant. Green paint, identifying the Wonthaggi origin. First state of the physical motif, on the drop forge line, the bang, bang, bang of the forge press audible across the Wonthaggi township. Distribution, every Australian hardware store. Mitre 10, BBC Hardware, McEwen's of Victoria, Harry's and Lloyd's of South Australia. Independent hardware retailers from Cairns to Hobart. Every suburban Australian shed had Cyclone tools. Every apprentice tradesman started with a Cyclone hammer. Every gardener owned a Cyclone spade. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Cyclone advertising ran in every Australian home renovation magazine, every garden publication, every rural weekly. The green Cyclone shovel became one of the visual signatures of Australian domestic life, as recognisable as the Victor lawnmower, the Hills hoist, the Sunbeam Mixmaster. Per Cyclone Tools' own corporate statement, published on the cyclone.com.au Our Story page, Cyclone Tools is a leading garden tools brand in Australia, producing over 350,000 quality garden tools annually. Let that number sit for a moment. 350,000 garden tools a year. Coming off a single Wonthaggi drop forge line. Everyone stamped Made in Australia. Everyone distributed through Bunnings, Mitre 10, Total Tools, Sydney Tools and Independent Hardware. Peak Wonthaggi workforce, approximately 200 in the 1980s and 1990s. One of the largest private employers in Bass Coast. Cyclone was, for 4 decades, a major reason young Wonthaggi school leavers stayed in town rather than moving to Melbourne. Dropforge apprenticeships trained generations of Bass Coast tradesmen. The factory was woven into the fabric of Wonthaggi civic life. 1988. Cyclone buys out Trojan, its main Australian competitor in the hand and garden tool market, and consolidates domestic tool manufacturing. General Manager Greg Lewis. Wonthaggi doubles again in factory floor area. The Trojan acquisition gives Cyclone a near monopoly on Australian domestic garden tool manufacturing. Reader testimony to the Bass Coast Post, 2026. I still have a geologist pick, screwdrivers, hammers and a tomahawk, and I still use them. But even at the empire's peak, even as 350,000 tools left Wonthaggi every year, the ownership of the Cyclone name was already passing through hands that did not forge anything. Chapter 7. The Ownership Pass. 1975. Sydney. Boral Limited, the Australian building materials and industrial conglomerate, acquires the Cyclone Company of Australia. Wonthaggi factory continues. Melbourne headquarters continues. The Cyclone name continues. On the shop floor at Corumbura Road, the change is invisible. Same drop forge line, same shovel blades, same green paint. 1993. Boral floats Azon, a subsidiary group bundling businesses that Boral had acquired via Johns Perry, Norman J. Hurl and Cyclone. Azon later becomes part of the Nilex Group. The Cyclone Garden and Hand Tool division moves with it, late 1990s to early 2000s. The garden and hand tool business, Cyclone, Nilex, Trojan, Supercraft, passes to Illinois Tool Works, ITW, the Chicago-based Fortune 200 diversified manufacturer, founded 1912 by Byron L. Smith at Glenview, Illinois, runs a decentralized acquisition-driven business model called 80-20, the principle that 80% of results come from 20% of inputs, applied ruthlessly across a portfolio of hundreds of acquired industrial businesses. On the shop floor at Wonthaggi, still invisible, the drop forge line still runs. The green shovels still arrive at Bunnings. The Australian corporate structure moves from Boral in Sydney to Nilex in Melbourne to ITW in Chicago. Each transfer looks like normal corporate consolidation. The Cyclone brand persists. The Wonthaggi payroll continues. The 3-tonne weekly steel plate order arrives every week. Here's the thing. The 1975 Boral acquisition, the 1993 Azon float, and the eventual ITW ownership all looked like normal Australian corporate reorganisation. Each transfer, however, degraded Wonthaggi's strategic priority one notch further from the boardroom. By the time ITW controlled Cyclone from Chicago, the Wonthaggi factory was one small line item in a Fortune 200 balance sheet, visible only to a divisional manager, invisible to the CEO. 2014. ITW under CEO David B. Spear executes a portfolio rationalisation. Spear's stated strategy: selectively divesting businesses that no longer represent a strong fit with our core platforms. The Australian Garden and Tools division, Cyclone, Nilex, Trojan is on the divestment list. And on the 21st of May 2014, 116 years after Chambers and Thompson founded Cyclone in a Melbourne beekeeping supply shop, a New York-listed diversified holding company called Griffon Corporation bought it. Chapter 8. Griffon arrives. 21st of May 2014. New York. Griffon Corporation announces via Business Wire the acquisition of Illinois Tool Works Australian Garden and Tools Division. The acquisition is executed through Griffon's subsidiary, the AMES companies. Purchase price, approximately $36 million. Expected annualized revenue contribution, approximately $65 million. The AM's press statement. The garden and tools business offers a full range of quality garden and hand tool products sold under various leading brand names including Cyclone, Nilex and Trojan. The garden and tools acquisition expands AMES's existing Australian lawn and garden operations. Read that again. Griffon Corporation paid $36 million, approximately 40 million Australian dollars at the 2014 exchange rate, for the entire Australian Cyclone, Nilex and Trojan garden and hand tool business. The Wonthaggi factory, the Grafton factory, the AMES Australasia infrastructure, the brand rights, the distribution agreements with Bunnings, Mitre 10 and the entire Australian hardware retail network. $36 million US. Griffon Corporation, New York, listed on the New York Stock Exchange under ticker GFF, headquartered in Long Island, New York. A diversified management and holding company running Clopay garage doors, the AMES company's lawn and garden operations, and formerly Closet Maid and Telephonics. Ronald J. Kramer is Griffon's chairman and chief executive officer. Born 1958. Chief Executive Officer since April 2008. Chairman since January 2018. Son-in-law of predecessor Harvey R. Blau. Former president of Wynn Resorts, the Las Vegas casino operator. His signature is on the 2014 Cyclone acquisition papers. Michael A. Sarika joins Griffon in January 2014, the same month as the Cyclone acquisition. President of the AMES companies. Later Senior Vice President, Griffon Corporation. Responsible for AMES operations globally. The AMES companies. Traces its United States heritage to 1774. American consumer and professional tool brands including AMES, True Temper, Razorback and Union Tools. AMES Australasia. Formed 2010. Headquartered in Doncaster, Melbourne. Now the corporate parent of Cyclone Tools Proprietary Limited. Includes Nilex, Hills, Northcote Pottery, Tuscan Path, Kelso and Westmix under the same Doncaster roof. On the shop floor at Corumbara Road, Wonthaggi. The changes announced. The letterhead changes. The corporate parent changes. Strategic control now moves from Chicago to Long Island, filtered through Doncaster. The 12-year Griffon countdown had started, and by 2024, on the Bunnings shelf in Wonthaggi's own Bunnings, 6 kilometres from the Corumbara Road factory, an Australian shopper could pick up a green-handled Cyclone shovel forged in Wonthaggi, and directly beside it, a grey-handled Cyclone shovel made in China. $5 cheaper. Chapter 9. The Green Shovel. The Bunnings Garden Tool Aisle, mid-2020s. On the racking, 2 shovels, both Cyclone brand, both same size, both same style, both distributed by AMES Australasia from the Doncaster warehouse. One has a green painted handle, stamped Made in Australia, forged from 3-tonne steel plate at Wonthaggi. Timber handle supplied from Grafton, NSW. The other has a hammer grey painted handle, made in China, same brand, same style, same box design, different origin. Per the Wonthaggi Sentinel Times, 29th of May, 2026. The green Cyclone shovels are made in Wonthaggi, the hammer grey shovels made in China. The China product is priced $5 or more below the price of the same style product made by the same company in Australia. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. Griffon Corporation, the New York-listed diversified holding company that bought Cyclone in 2014 for $36 million US, is through AMES Australasia sourcing the same shovel from 2 production lines. One in Wonthaggi, Bass Coast, Australia, forged by drop forge workers who train on the same line their fathers trained on. One in China, made by Chinese workers at a fraction of the Australian labour cost. Both go to the same Bunnings shelf. The Chinese one is priced $5 lower. The Australian shopper does what the Australian shopper does. Reaches for the cheaper shovel. AMES Australasia's Bunnings order book from Wonthaggi shrinks. AMES Australasia's Bunnings order book from China grows. The Sentinel Times, in the same 29th May 2026 coverage, landing the same product from China and undercutting their own Australian-made product on the shelf, must also be playing a part. Here's the thing. The green versus grey Cyclone shovel on the Bunnings shelf is not consumer choice. It is a supply-side pricing decision. AMES Australasia, the Doncaster-headquartered Australian subsidiary of Griffon Corporation, set the wholesale price of the Australian-made green shovel above the wholesale price of the Chinese-made grey shovel. Bunnings, as retailer, passed the differential to the shelf as required by its own margin structure. The consumer merely completed the transaction. The pricing decision had already resolved. The green shovel was priced to lose. The grey shovel was priced to win. The Wonthaggi factory was losing to itself. Across the mid-2020s, Wonthaggi shovel volumes fall. The 3-tonne weekly steel plate orders shrinks to 2 tonnes, then 1, then to a fraction. The drop forge line runs shorter shifts. The Wonthaggi workforce declines from 200 to 100 to 50 to 15. And on the 8th of June 2026, Griffon Corporation announced to the New York Stock Exchange that it was exiting Australia entirely. Chapter 10. The Closure, 8th of June 2026. New York. Griffon Corporation announces via SEC Form 8-AK, filing a definitive agreement to sell AMES Australasia to a management-led joint venture. Deal terms. Griffon receives $185 million at closing, plus a $50 million subordinated note. Total consideration approximately $235 million. Griffon retains a 49% equity interest. The remaining 51% is held by an investment group led by Simon Hupfeld, who becomes executive chairman of the AMES Australasia joint venture. Ronald J. Kramer, per Griffon SEC Exhibit 99-5. This joint venture will best position AMES Australasia to serve its valued customers while generating both immediate and longer-term value for Griffon shareholders. Simon Hupfeld. We are thrilled to embark on this next chapter for our business and the people behind it. Griffon reframes the exit as strategic evolution into a pure-play building products company. AMES North America, separately, is combined with Vanampri Tools into a new joint venture called Veritage Brands, with private equity firm OnCap. Griffon is exiting the tools business globally. May 2026. The Wonthaggi Sentinel Times reports on 29th of May, 2026. 75-year-old Wonthaggi Cyclone factory to close. Bunnings in October. September 2026. The Grafton, New South Wales facility, which had supplied Wonthaggi's timber handles for 76 years, closes. Grafton workforce redundancies. The Clarence Valley loses its largest hand tool employer, October 2026. The Wonthaggi factory closes. 15 remaining workers, some with nearly 50 years' service. The AMES Australasia statement to the Sentinel Times. The decision was not taken lightly and reflects the sustained economic pressures facing local manufacturing in Australia. Career counselling, outplacement, human resources support, employee assistance program. The Wonthaggi factory that was built from a dying coal mine's timber, held together by steel cable, unstranded from the Eastern Area mine, and cement smuggled from Tasmania by San Remo fishermen, staffed for 76 years by drop forge workers who trained on the same line as their fathers, is closed. Production moves offshore, to China. And on the Corumbura Road site, the 2-acre parcel that runs from what is now Dan Murphy's to the Mackenzie Street retail stores, the big box retail redevelopment was already underway, including a Bunnings. Chapter 11. The Bunnings Car Park. Walk into the Wonthaggi Bunnings today. Corumbura Road, Bass Coast, Victoria. 6 kilometres inland from Bass Strait. The garden tool aisle, on the racking. The grey-handled Cyclone shovel, made in China. Priced approximately $5 lower than the green-handled Australian-made Cyclone shovel would have been. Except the green-handled Australian-made Cyclone shovel has been discontinued. The last green shovels left Wonthaggi in October 2026. Directly beneath the shopper's feet, 76 years earlier, a drop forge worker stood at the press that Lou Gray had installed in 1950. 50 metres from the current Bunnings loading dock, the pattern shop where the wooden templates for the shovel blades were carved. 100 metres east, the office where Lou Gray, the first plant manager, hired 40 men in October 1950 to run the newly erected coal mine timber factory. Beside the current Bunnings entrance, the approximate location of the drop forge press, whose bang, bang, bang was audible across the Wonthaggi township for 76 years. Here's the kicker. Griffon Corporation acquired the Australian Cyclone, Nilex and Trojan. Business in May 2014 for approximately $36 million. Griffon exited the same business in June 2026 for approximately $235 million, a 6.5 times return on paper while closing the 2 Australian factories that had made the products. 12 years, 6.5 times, 15 workers left at the Corumbara Road gate. Read that again. Griffon paid $36 million for it. Griffon walked out with $235 million, and 15 Australians walked out of the Corumbara Road gate. The Wonthaggi State coal mine that provided the timber for the factory closed in 1968, killed when its main customer, the Victorian Railways, switched from coal to diesel and electric locomotive power. The factory that was built from that mine's timber closed in 2026, killed by cheaper Chinese shovels arriving at the Bunnings loading dock at a lower landed cost than the Wonthaggi shovels. 58 years apart. Different mechanisms, same disease. Cheaper alternatives displacing local supply, until local supply is no longer economic to maintain. Lesson 1. They built the factory from a dead mine. They killed the factory the same way. In 1950, Cyclone erected the Wonthaggi factory from the salvaged timber of the Wonthaggi State Coal Mine's No. 18 shaft, a mine that was dying because the Victorian Railways, its main customer, was progressively switching from coal to diesel and electric locomotive power. 18 years later, in 1968, that coal mine formally closed. 58 years after the mine's closure, in 2026, the factory that had been built from its timber closed too, because cheaper Chinese shovels had made Wonthaggi shovels uneconomic on the Bunnings shelf. Different mechanisms, technological substitution for the mine, offshore labour arbitrage for the factory, but the same pattern. Cheaper alternatives displacing local supply, until local supply is no longer economic to maintain. The coal mine died first. The factory followed. The Australian shovel-making capacity that had lasted 76 years at Corumbara Road ended in a Bunnings shelf price differential of $5. Lesson 2. The weapon was a cheaper version of their own shovel. Griffon Corporation, through AMES Australasia, did not close the Wonthaggi factory by fiat. It closed the factory by pricing. It placed on every Bunnings shelf, alongside the green-handled Australian-made Cyclone shovel, a grey-handled Chinese-made Cyclone shovel, same brand, same style, same company, priced $5 cheaper. The Australian shopper completed the transaction. The Wonthaggi order book shrank. The workforce contracted from 200 to 100 to 50 to 15. 15 final workers walked out the gate in October 2026. The company had killed its own Australian product, not by discontinuing it, but by undercutting it, with itself. The AMES statement to the Sentinel Times cited the sustained economic pressures facing local manufacturing in Australia. The pressures were, in significant part, the AMES Australasia sourcing decision to bring the same shovel from China at a lower landed cost. The company had built the weapon that killed its own factory. Lesson 3. 12 years from buyout to closure. 6.5 times the entry price. Griffon Corporation acquired Cyclone from Illinois Tool Works on the 21st of May 2014 for approximately $36 million. 12 years and 18 days later, on the 8th of June 2026, Griffon announced the sale of AMES Australasia to a management-led joint venture for approximately $235 million, retaining a 49% equity stake, 6.5 times the entry price. 12 years. 2 closed Australian factories. 15 final Wonthaggi workers walked out the gate. The corporate maths worked. The Australian manufacturing base did not. Griffon's own words to the New York Stock Exchange described the exit as a strategic evolution into a pure-play building products company. The Australian shovel-making capacity that had run for 76 years at Wonthaggi was the collateral. 1898. Chambers and Thompson found Cyclone in a Melbourne beekeeping supply shop. 1950. Lou Gray opens the Wonthaggi factory built from the salvaged timber of the closed coal mine. 1975. Boral buys Cyclone. 1988. Cyclone buys Trojan. 2014. Griffon Corporation buys Cyclone for $36 million. June 2026. Griffon sells AMES Australasia for $235 million. October 2026. 15 Australians walk out of the Wonthaggi gate for the last time. 128 years of Australian garden tool manufacturing. 76 years of Wonthaggi forge work. 12 years of Griffon ownership. 15 workers walking out the gate. 6.5 times the entry price. The factory is a car park. The shovel is imported. She's a beauty.